Mayor Mamdani sounds the alarm about a massive $12 billion budget deficit and calls to tax the rich to close the gap.
Other news, Mayor Mamdani announcing today his plan to tackle a whopping $12 billion deficit.
In case you missed it, as we mentioned, Mayor Mamdani and the city council opting to delay his executive budget, saying the state needs to deliver more money to the city.
A budget breakthrough in New York City. The city council says it has cobbled together a savings plan that would solve the city's multi-billion-dollar deficit without raising property taxes.
$12 billion gone, just like that. Not over years, not over decades, but in only 4 months after a new mayor took office. And now, the man who promised to transform New York City is standing in City Hall, doing the one thing he said would never be needed. He's begging Albany for a bailout, begging the state to save the city, begging for money that may not even exist. But what happens next is even more shocking, because Governor Kathy Hochul's response is not support. It's a flat, political, cold no. And just like that, New York City is left standing on the edge of a $12 billion financial crater with no safety net in sight. The question is no longer about politics. It's about survival. And what happens when the biggest city in America starts running out of money faster than anyone expected? New York City, one of the richest and most powerful cities in the world, was now being described in crisis terms. A budget gap reportedly reaching into the billions had suddenly become impossible to ignore. And the most shocking part? It all unfolded in just 4 months. When Zohran Mamdani took office, many believed he represented a new era for the city. His campaign promised fairness, higher taxes on the wealthy, and stronger public services. His supporters believed he would fix long-standing inequality problems that had built up for decades. But reality inside government works differently than campaign slogans. Behind the scenes, financial officials were already warning about a massive structural gap. Spending commitments were rising faster than revenue. Previous budgets had reportedly hidden real costs, delaying the pain for the next administration. Still, no one expected the situation to escalate this quickly. By early spring, the numbers being discussed in closed-door meetings reportedly reached staggering levels. A deficit that started as a few $billion was now being described as something closer to a long-term structural imbalance, one that could reach over $10 billion when future obligations were included. And that is when the tone changed completely. At a press conference inside City Hall's rotunda, Mamdani made a direct appeal to the state government in Albany. He pushed for emergency financial support, arguing that the city could not handle the gap alone. But the response from Albany was not what he hoped for. Governor Kathy Hochul reportedly rejected key requests tied to new revenue measures and made it clear that New York City needed to review its own spending before expecting state intervention. This created an immediate political standoff. On one side, a mayor arguing the system was broken and underfunded. On the other, a governor insisting the city needed to manage its own budget responsibly. And in the middle of all this, a city of over 8 million people watching the conflict unfold while service costs, transit issues, and safety concerns continued to rise. But this is only the beginning. Because while politicians argue over numbers and responsibility, something far more visible is happening underneath the surface of New York City, especially in the system millions depend on every single day. And that system is starting to show serious cracks. The situation inside New York City's government did not calm down after the first warning signs. In fact, it escalated even further. Behind closed doors, officials were now dealing with a budget problem that was no longer just a shortfall. It was being described as a structural gap stretching across multiple fiscal years. Estimates reportedly placed the combined pressure at several $billion, some discussions even pointing toward a figure that could approach $12 billion when long-term obligations were included. That is not a small accounting issue. That is a full-scale financial crisis. And yet, what made this situation even more intense was not just the size of the gap, but the political promises surrounding it. Zohran Mamdani entered office with a very clear message: no major service cuts, no reduction in public programs, and no burden shifted onto working-class New Yorkers. Instead, his strategy focused on raising revenue from wealthy individuals and closing tax loopholes. In theory, it sounds straightforward. In reality, it quickly became complicated. One of the key proposals, tax changes targeting luxury real estate, ran into legal uncertainty. Another attempt to adjust corporate tax structures tied to state approval was rejected at the state level. Governor Hochul made it clear that Albany would not automatically approve new revenue tools without spending reforms on the city side. Her message was simple: look at your expenses. That one sentence became the center of the entire political conflict, because Mamdani's administration was now stuck between two impossible pressures. On one side, campaign promises that demanded no cuts to services. On the other side, financial reality that required either new income or reduced spending. Neither option was politically easy. And while this battle was happening in press conferences and policy meetings, something else was quietly getting worse in the background. The city's core systems, especially public transit, were beginning to show visible stress. The subway, which carries millions of riders every day, was already dealing with rising complaints. Reports of delays, safety concerns, and operational strain were increasing. In a system this large, even small percentage changes affect thousands of people instantly. And that is where the real pressure started to build. Because budgets are not just numbers on paper, they turn into real-world consequences very quickly in a city like New York. A delayed repair becomes a broken train line. A funding cut becomes fewer safety personnel. A budget freeze becomes slower emergency response. And suddenly, what looked like a political disagreement in City Hall starts showing up on the platforms underground. But the most alarming part of this entire situation is still ahead. Because while the city struggles to close a multi-billion-dollar gap, another layer of pressure is entering the system, this time from Washington. And that changes everything. Just when New York City thought the financial battle couldn't get more complicated, Washington entered the picture and immediately raised the stakes. The federal government began reviewing funding tied to New York City programs, including money that flows into transportation, housing, and public infrastructure. These aren't minor budget lines. They are the backbone of how the city keeps running every single day. And the reason? Political conflict. The dispute centered around enforcement cooperation policies, immigration-related coordination, and broader political disagreements between city leadership and federal authorities. In response, there were threats, direct or indirect, of reducing or withholding funding. For New York City, that kind of pressure is dangerous, because the city does not just rely on local taxes. It depends heavily on federal contributions that help sustain the subway system, school programs, and housing initiatives. Estimates suggest the city receives billions annually in federal support across multiple departments. Now imagine even a fraction of that being delayed or reduced. A budget gap that was already measured in billions would suddenly grow even larger. And this is where the crisis stops being theoretical and becomes physical. Because while politicians argue over funding streams, New Yorkers are dealing with something far more immediate: the subway system they rely on every single day. The subway is not just transport in New York, it is survival infrastructure. Millions of people use it daily, including workers who have no alternative, nurses working overnight shifts, restaurant staff finishing late hours, cleaning crews, delivery workers, and hospital employees, all depending on trains that must run on time, every time. But recent months have shown rising strain. Reports of disruptions, delays, and safety incidents have increased. Even small statistical changes in such a massive system translate into thousands of real-life moments of stress for riders. In one reported case, a passenger was pushed onto tracks at a busy station and survived. In another, a violent incident occurred during a crowded commute. These events, whether frequent or not, create a psychological shift in how people experience the system. And that shift matters. Because once riders start feeling unsafe, they change behavior, they stand closer to exits, they avoid certain trains, they adjust work schedules if possible. Some even start looking for alternatives. But for many New Yorkers, there are no alternatives. That's the core pressure point of this entire crisis. The system must function, even when finances are unstable. But the finances are unstable, even while the system demands more investment. It becomes a loop that feeds itself. And inside City Hall, the pressure is building toward a deadline that cannot be ignored. A budget extension has already been pushed back. Officials are now scrambling for time, trying to negotiate with the state while also preparing contingency plans that nobody wants to talk about publicly. Because every delay only increases the size of the problem. And soon, New York City will reach a moment where avoiding decisions becomes impossible. That moment is coming faster than anyone expected, and what happens next will decide whether this is just a political crisis or something far more serious for the entire city. By the time the budget deadline was pushed back, the tension inside New York City's administration had already reached a breaking point. Officials were no longer just discussing long-term planning, they were now working against the clock. The executive budget deadline extension wasn't presented as a victory or a breakthrough. It was presented as a necessity, a pause, a delay, a signal that the situation was not ready to be finalized. But delays don't solve budget crises. They only postpone the moment of truth. Behind the scenes, the numbers were still not aligning. The city was facing a multi-billion-dollar structural gap spread across current and upcoming fiscal years. Depending on how different obligations were counted, pensions, contracts, transit subsidies, and service expansions, the pressure could stretch even higher than initially admitted in public statements. And every proposed solution ran into the same problem. Someone has to pay for it. Zohran Mamdani's administration continued to push a familiar strategy: raise revenue through taxes on high-value properties and wealthy individuals, close loopholes, and protect public services from cuts. But the political reality was not cooperating. State leadership rejected or delayed key proposals, arguing that New York City needed to reduce expenses before expecting new revenue tools to be approved. That position created a deadlock between City Hall and Albany. And deadlocks in government are dangerous, because the system doesn't stop while politicians argue. It keeps running. Subway trains still move, hospitals still operate, schools still open, garbage still gets collected, but behind every service is a budget line, and behind every budget line is a limit. When that limit gets stretched too far, the effects don't appear all at once. They show up gradually. A delayed maintenance cycle here, a reduced staffing level there, a postponed infrastructure upgrade somewhere else. And over time, those small delays become visible failures. This is why the subway has become such a powerful symbol in this crisis. It is where financial stress turns into lived experience. Every rider feels it differently. Some notice longer wait times, others notice crowded platforms, others notice safety concerns that make them more alert than they used to be. And for millions of working New Yorkers, there is no choice but to accept that risk every day, because the subway is not optional. It is essential. At the same time, political pressure outside the city is increasing. Federal funding threats add another layer of uncertainty. If even part of that support is reduced, the budget gap does not shrink. It expands instantly. So the administration is now trapped between three forces: state resistance to new taxes, federal uncertainty over funding, and internal pressure to avoid cutting services. All three cannot be satisfied at once. Something has to give. And as the deadline approaches, the most important question is no longer about political messaging or campaign promises. It is about what actually gets funded and what does not. Because budgets are not abstract documents. They are decisions about real life, and New York City is now approaching the point where those decisions can no longer be delayed.